All right, you guys. Now we're live streaming. Now, Tanya, in 2 minutes, I will introduce you, and then you can take it from there. Okay? So we'll do it at 11:35. It's actually about a minute and 25 seconds. So you can count down in your mind about that, and then it'll be terrific. And I'm so glad to see you, Tanya. Harvey, hi. Hello, Martha. Hello, Sila. Hello, Charles. Welcome, Charles. It's nice to see you again. Bonnie, welcome back. Hello, John from the iPhone. Hi, Kira's here. Hello, Kira. Tiffany and Stacy and Elena. Hello, Elena. Welcome. Who else is here? Oh, Evelyn. Evelyn is here. Well, nice to see you. And Ananda, you're always welcome, Ananda. Gabe, hello. And Chaplain James, of course. All right. Welcome, everyone. So we'll start in about 1 minute, you guys.
And do you know how to keep your volume on, but to shut off those annoying reminders from your email?
Wait. Okay. I'm sorry. Multitasking is not my friend. The question was annoying what from the email?
Whenever I get an email, I get a little bip. I get a little sound.
Oh,
Just
yes.
wondering whether maybe I'll just turn off
If
my
you
email.
go to your notifications and cancel your notifications,
I'm
that
just going
might
to
do it.
quit. I'm just going to great. I'm quitting email. That will do it.
Okay, let's see. There we go.
I want to introduce you to my research assistant.
Oh, you have a research
This is
assistant.
research assistant number one, who likes to come
Oh,
on screen whenever am on Zoom. Yes.
all right. I'm gonna now introduce you, Tanya. Now let me
Okay.
just pull up this lovely little okay. Can everyone see this? Okay. Um, Hello and welcome to another special edition of the Saturday Spirituality Group. Today's guest is Tanya Marie Luhrmann. She is an American psychological anthropologist known for her studies of modern day witches, charismatic Christians, and studies of how culture shapes psychotic, dissociative, and related experiences. She has also studied culture and morality and the training of psychiatrists. So, without further ado, please, Tanya, take it from here.
Hi, everybody. Um, I have a presentation that I thought it would be helpful to walk through. Usually I'm talking to scholars, if you signal it as like too much, just let me know. Let me say before I share it that my overall commitments is that I'm not going to make an assumption that God is real or not real. I'm going to talk about spiritual experience, but I'm not going to make an assumption about whether God exists or whether at a time that somebody hears God speak, whether that's really God or not. And kind of not my job. I'm going to talk about people who hear God. I think that I'm going to argue that voices are real. So people have these vivid experiences of an invisible mind which speaks to them. Um, but not all some voices are caused by madness or psychosis. Um, but madness or psychosis is not the only pathway to have these experiences. It's one of several pathways. All of these pathways respond to learning, to some ways in which people pay attention to their experience. And I think that these studying this teaches us something about ordinary human consciousness. First of all, that our minds are full of people and full of commands, and that thoughts, I don't know whether this makes sense, well, how this will sound to you, but I think thoughts are feelings. They are things people respond to and feel, and that this shapes the way that we respond. So, shall I go ahead and share my screen? Does that sound like okay? So I'm gonna. I think I. Let me see if I've got permission. I do have permission. All right. What are you guys seeing? Are you seeing some?
It says
Voices.
Voices,
voices,
voices.
Tanya
Okay.
Luhrmann.
And so when I go like this, hold on. Why can I not switch? Um, all right, something has gone wrong. I'm so sorry. Uh, let me try this one. Ah, good. Do you still see voices?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay. Do you see Martin Luther King Jr.?
Yes.
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 Okay. Do you see a
He's
bunch of words
singing.
as well?
Yes.
Martin Luther King, 20th century?
Okay, but you're not seeing the next slide and the next.
No.
No.
Excellent. Okay. So let me go ahead and share that. So I'm going to talk about these experiences. And when I give this talk just to scholars, I begin by using Martin Luther King Jr. as an example. He was in the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycotts. He had received death threats against his family. He wasn't sure whether he should continue. And he sat at his kitchen table and he prayed. And when he did that, he heard God say that he would be with him. And so he decided to go forward. He was thinking of quitting and he went forward. Those are the kinds of experiences that I'm talking about. A voice is the experience of being spoken to in the absence of a human speaker. This is our rock star, Joan of Arc, who heard as many as seemed to hear God speak many times a day. The proximate cause of these experiences, so I'm not talking about God, but I'm talking about the intermediate cause where we all, if God exists, we all, in effect, hear God through the filter of our own minds. And I'm going to suggest that the proximate cause, the intermediate cause of any voice is a thought that somebody feels that's not their own and not inside them. There's something that happens to these experiences, these mental experiences, that makes them feel more outside. They're pretty common in the general population. So it really varies with the way you ask the question. So if you have a kind of clinical approach in the way you ask the question, you get 3 to 10%. When I talk to charismatic Christians or Christians who want an intimate experience of God, it's like 1 in 3 Christians will say that they have heard God speak at least once in a way they could hear with their ears. And if you ask the question in a way that's like full of detail and doesn't seem like you're asking about mental illness, like as many as 70–80% will say they've had some kind of audible experience at least once. And the non-audible experiences we think are much more common than that. Okay, many people in America, and possibly I don't quite have a read of this group yet, but many people will think that commonly associate voices with psychosis. And I sometimes often will use the word madness instead of psychosis because the word madness doesn't presume a diagnosis. But there's some kind of pathway in the body, for want of a better term, in which people, when they experience madness, they hear many, many voices. Many of those voices have many words, and many of those words are quite mean. Not true for everybody who carries a diagnosis, but it's true for many. There are many scientists, particularly in recent years, who suggest that all voice hearing experiences come from madness, that there is what people will call a psychosis continuum. So there are people who are very, very mad and who meet criteria, and there are people like Martin Luther King Jr. who have a little bit of whatever, Martin Luther King Jr., Joan of Arc, they have a little bit of what people who end up in hospitals have, and that's what's leading to their experience of hearing a voice. I don't think that's true. I think there's something much more fundamental about our relationship with our thought, the way that we experience our own minds. So I began thinking about this in the early 80s, when I was studying people who call themselves witches and magicians and initiates of the Western mysteries and druids. And I had gone to that group to study how apparently reasonable people could come to believe in apparently unreasonable beliefs, which to the point of view of a scholarly audience, belief in magic is an unreasonable belief. And what I really saw was that people had vivid experiences. That was much more important than belief. I mean, that's a complicated thing to say, but what I saw was that I arrived in these groups, I got initiated into these different kinds of spiritual pursuits, and people would say to me, if you want to understand magic or witchcraft or whatever, you've got to practice, you've got to do the thing. And that some people are better than other people, and that everybody who practices is going to feel something. And what they felt is magical power shooting through their veins. They felt the presence of invisible beings. They sometimes heard a voice when no one was present. They had a whole range of what we would call spiritual experiences. And I thought that I saw that some people had these experiences more than others, and that's something about the way they were practicing, which was they would meet in a group and they did something that looked a lot like prayer. They'd meet together in a group, people would shut their eyes, they would try to have a internal mental story about a god or a goddess, and there would be a kind of there would be a journey in that story. You would be in the room, you would go somewhere, you'd float down the river, or you'd rise through the sky, you'd encounter a spiritual being, you'd interact with the spiritual being, and you'd come back. And I thought that and it seemed to me that when people did more of that, they had more vivid experiences. So that's the kind of intellectual rabbit, for want of a better term, that I've been exploring for the last, 4 decades. Horrifying thought, but nevertheless. And there have been really 2 tracks of my research. I've been spending a lot of time talking to people who seem mad, many people who carry a diagnosis of schizophrenia. I've been looking at people in different countries. I've also been talking to people who have vivid spiritual experiences, many of them Christian, but not all of them Christian. I've spent time with the witches, but also time in what was then Bombay with Parsi Zoroastrians. And what I really do is I talk to people. So I sit with somebody and I kind of ask them what they're experiencing. And I ask a lot of follow-up questions, and I'm really interested in, was this experience audible? Did you turn your head to see who was speaking? Where did you feel that the voice came from? What else happened when you heard the voice? Could you see anything? Could you see that with your eyes? Did you feel a presence? Is the voice present when you're not talking, when it's not talking? All these kinds of follow-up questions that depend on having talked to a lot of other people in different kinds of practices and paths and domains. And so over the past few decades, I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people. And the first thing I'm going to do is try to make the argument that there's a kind of a pathway that's not a pathway of madness. And I'm going to make an initial argument for 3 causal factors. So I'm going to say that if you have a little more of one of these 3, you're a little bit more likely to have this experience. I should say that I think that many of these pathways coexist, so that somebody with psychosis can also have experiences that are generated by non-psychosis, by the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So the first the first thing I say is that in my work, I have found that training matters. What do I mean by that? So let me talk to you about evangelical Christians, and these kinds of evangelicals, they want a very vivid experience of God. They think that God can talk back to them. And if you go to a church like this, you see that the new Christian learns that the mind isn't private, but that thoughts and images and sensations you might have understood as God are actually, you might have understood as your own experience. They're really God speaking. So you have to think differently about your mind. Here's an example. When somebody's praying over me, I'm just receiving it, and all of a sudden I hear, go to Kansas. That's an inner mind. Because I was debating whether to go to Kansas, where our parents lived, but I hadn't been thinking about it within a 24-hour period. So the thought pops into her mind, and she says, oh, that could be God. So somebody comes to a church like this, they've got to learn to practice talking with God. And often this practice looks like this. Two people together, their eyes are shut, they are having some dialogue in their mind. And what they're doing is really two things. They're doing mental imagery cultivation. So they are imagining, I'm not saying that God is imaginary, but they're using their imagination to feel that God is interacting with them, that God has their arm around their shoulders, that they're sitting on a park bench and God is right next to them. They're having they're having lunch with God. God's talking to them about his day. They're talking to God about theirs. This is the way that people in these groups talk. And they're doing a kind of as if. These are sophisticated people. They know perfectly well that if they're asking God what's going on in his life, there's a little bit of, maybe that's a little bit their understanding of God rather than God. But they're talking to God as if God is there and responding to them. And they say things like this. I recognize God's, after some months, I recognize God's voice the way I recognize my mom's voice on the phone. And what I see is this. Sorry. When you read the hundreds of books that tell people how to do this, those books don't think that God's voice is supposed to be audible. But when I talk to people, I see that if they're doing a lot of prayer, sometimes God does speak out loud. So this is a woman who says, the Lord spoke to me clearly in April, like Mayor April, to start a school. And I say, you heard this audibly? And she says, yeah, yeah. I say, were you alone? And she goes on and she says, I was just praying. I wasn't praying anything really, just thinking about God. And I heard start a school. So, and this was an audible experience for her. You can do this without God. So I've been hanging out with, sorry, I've got a chorus from my research assistants in the background. I'm hoping you can't hear it. So I've been talking to people who call themselves tulpamancers. So this is a tulpa, this is an invisible friend. And people use these techniques they don't think this is supernatural. They use these techniques and they create relationships with invisible companions, which come to feel to them as if they are really present, as if they are sentient, they can think, they can respond to them. They tell people who do this, talk about two people sharing one body. So it's a technique, a set of techniques they learn. So the second thing I want to say that I can see about this, what I'm going to argue is a non-mad pathway, is that there really are some people who are better than others. So I have given people the absorption scale, which is the scale. It's got 34 items. And there are items like this. Sometimes I feel and experience things the way I did as a child. I can be greatly moved by eloquent or poetic language. I mean, you see the rest of it. So you give it to somebody and you say, which of these statements are true for you? And what I see again and again and again, study after study, is that the more truths somebody checks off on the absorption scale, the more vividly they experience God. the more they say they've heard God's voice, or they've heard their telpa's voice, or they've heard their, not, maybe not their telpa's voice, they've heard God's voice, they've heard they've heard a pretend companion's voice, they've had vivid other spiritual experiences. So that's kind of striking to me. The third factor is that the way that you think about thought matters. And so I'll go ahead and present this. We can come back to it because I'm going to do a deep dive into a slightly egg-heady argument. This is the argument. I think that ordinary humans, people, what do I mean by that? I mean that people who don't have a special characteristics of meeting a expectations for a diagnostic category. All humans have conflicting intuitions about how thought works. So I think that around the world, people have kind of a default expectation for how thought works, that it's inside of you, that it's private, that it's your thought, and that it change the way that you think, but it doesn't kind of seep out of your mind and affect things in the world. But everybody has experiences that violate that ordinary model. So you have dreams that sometimes they seem really, really powerful, that they didn't come from inside you. You have powerful anger sometimes. It feels like it didn't come from inside you. When you curse somebody, it can feel like an action, like you're doing something in the world. And so I think that their culture kind of picks up these conflicting ideas or these intuitions we have and it elaborates them. So ideas like cursing and prayer and feeling inspired, they all kind of suggest that it's possible for, thoughts out there like a poem to somehow come into your mind, or if you curse somebody, it can affect them. I'm going to talk about that as porosity. That's the idea that the mind-world boundary is permeable in non-ordinary ways, and the thought is potent. It can be powerful. So I ran this big project a couple of years ago, and this is the crew. We worked in 5 parts of the world, and we did these rich, open-ended interviews, and we did these short face-to-face interviews, and we gave surveys to undergraduates. And we found something pretty cool, which is that no matter where we went, no matter how we did the research, the more porosity ideas somebody assented to, the more voices they heard, and the more other vivid experiences they had, the more absorption they identified or assented to, the more voices and other things they heard. And it turns out that the more minutes per day they pray, the more voices and vivid experiences they have. So to summarize that piece of the argument, I see these 3 factors: practice, proclivity, and porosity. All of them facilitate the experience of thought as not being your own, not inside. A few thoughts. We don't know why this thought rather than that thought. They seem to work together. So these factors, you can sort of show statistically that they interact with each other. And so there's something about the way that your attention to mental events leads to some mental events seeming to be more external and more in the world real. Okay, so I want to say that that's one pathway that's not a pathway of madness. Okay, so let me go back to madness. There are 2 things I want to say, and I think I can do this in 10 minutes. One is that I've looked at people in a lot of different parts of the world. I'll talk about 3 parts of the world today. I think that the voice content, so what a voice of madness says, and whether it feels, and its valence, whether it feels good or bad, that shifts across cultural lines. The other thing I want to say is that I think that we're acquiring evidence that sometimes the religious expert or the shaman, that's kind of a shorthand term for somebody in a society who is understood to be able to talk to the gods. Sometimes the shaman looks like they're vulnerable to psychosis. And something about the religious practice changes their vulnerability or changes whether they look sick to other people. And so let me begin by saying that I'm going to start by saying that psychotic voices seem like they're a thing of the body, but they look different in other social worlds. So I'm going to talk about the first of a series of papers that I wrote about this. And we did these interviews, and I did a bunch of them. But my colleagues in Chennai in South India and also did some of them. And I did all the interviews in the US. And then my colleagues in Chennai did a bunch of interviews in South India. And then I came out to South India and I re-interviewed some of those people. That English is the language of schooling in India. So a lot of people speak English. And then I interviewed a bunch of other people. And then I went to Ghana, to Accra. And I also spent some time in Cape Coast. They're two different studies. And in Ghana, I did the interviews, but I had a Ghanaian woman with me. And then I left, and then she went and did another set of interviews. And so I tried to kind of protect against the idea that what I was seeing was just the result of being a white person intruding in a place where people mostly didn't have white skin. This is what I saw. I saw that in San Mateo, the place in California where I was doing these interviews, the voices are often pretty violent, a lot of violent commands. And at least in this first study, not one of the Americans that I was talking to reported a dominant positive voice. In Chennai, over half my small sample heard kin, people they were related to, like parents and mother-in-law and father, sisters, and the kin could be pretty annoying. But people would also say things like, it's like, if my mother, I like having my mother around. And the commands were often like, clean up, do chores, stop smoking. They weren't hurt, jump, kill. They weren't like, kill yourself. I mean, it's always hard. These experiences are pretty complicated, and people don't always talk about all of their experiences. But it was a striking difference. Here's another one of the differences in Chennai. The voices that were really mean talked about sex, or a lot of them talked about sex. So a lot of American voices that talked about sex, and as many of you know, when somebody is mad, they hear mad voices, there's often a physical dimension to the experience. People feel things on their body. And in my experience with a small sample, in the Americans in California, those were not necessarily bad experiences. They were often kind of satisfying experiences. In Chennai, when the voices talked about sex, they were often humiliating experiences. So the voices would shame people in public. Somebody would have the experience of the person who's hearing the voice would sort of have the idea like the voice was watching them have sex, and that made them very uncomfortable. Or the voice was talking about how everybody in the room knew that they were masturbating. So that was pretty striking. It was as if the meanness in Chennai was heard as a voice, about sex, and the meanness in the US was heard and had more to do with violence. In Accra, half the sample heard God, and they would say things like, God just tells me to do the right thing. If I didn't have these voices, I would have been dead long ago. And so in Accra, people were pretty hesitant to talk about negative voices. And I'm pretty sure they heard them, but they wanted to kind of diminish them. They wanted to not hear them. They would talk about God teaching them not to listen to those, that God would keep them away from the demons. And so I thought that this had something to do with the way people thought about thinking, that in the States, interior experiences is really highly salient. And, in your private space is really important to you. And the idea that some intruder is coming into your private space, that's just terribly upsetting for people. At least that's the way I'm guessing. In India, there's this real cultural invitation that the interior experiences of other people is really salient. And, other people, particularly senior people, should be knowing what junior people are thinking. Kind of makes sense that people would hear their seniors. And in Ghana, there are a lot of ideas about witchcraft, and the thoughts of others are dangerous. You really need to protect yourself. And I thought I heard those ideas. And I think that there is, what do I say here? So this is what I think. I think that when somebody falls ill in this pathway, they experience a lot of auditory and quasi-auditory stuff, a lot of different stuff. And they start hearing it in ways that are shaped in part by their culture. And they start hearing different things. Okay, this is the final thing I want to say. I think there's evidence that training or practice can avert or reduce or minimize, to some extent, for some people, the madness. I'm going to talk about experience of a Kung Fu. These are experts in Ghana, in West Africa. These are folks who talk to the gods. This is also sometimes called the traditional religion. And it's this kind of pyramidal shape. So you kind of got a great god on top, but then you got all these other gods. So this is kind of like Voodoo, Bahia, Candomblé. You got a lot of spiritual beings with whom somebody can interact. And the expert often interacts through an altar. This comes off of the internet. And the gods often speak individually and personally to the person who's the expert. So I apologize for this, how complicated this slide is, but I thought it would be helpful so that you could just take a look at it. So there are all these people in Ghana, and who becomes an Kung Fu? Well, the person who gets called so the god has to call. The god calls this individual, often in their late teens, often a time when people who develop schizophrenia have their first episode of psychosis. The god calls out loud. The person who is called gets into this kind of possessed state. So they're behaving that they're in a trance. They look crazy to other people. And then people will say this very easily. I looked crazy. They thought of taking me to the psychiatric hospital. And it's a kind of a big deal to become a Kung Fu because you have to drop out of school. You wear like nothing but a sheet for a year. Not everybody earns a lot of money this way. Anyway, so if you follow the call and you agree to go for training, you go for a year or two of training, and people say that what you've got to do is listen to who's talking, hear the God, ignore the demon, and you've got to practice being possessed and talking to the God outside of the possession again and again and again. And people say that that this training works. The person who becomes an Kung Fu comes to at least enjoy the gods, and that if the person who's called doesn't respond, they're going to go crazy. And I met a couple of people in the hospital who, their relatives said, well, she was called by the gods, but I said, no, she cannot be trained because sometimes people think that these people are a bit, crazy. Okay, this is the team I was working with in Ghana. And my piece of the project was that I would I would go, they found people for me who were a Kung Fu and Christians who had vivid experiences of gods. And they interviewed them. And then I went over for a month and I talked to people for an hour or more, and I asked them what they were hearing. And I won't play this track, but it's unless Dan thinks it's a good idea. But it's like it's a I don't know 45-second track. It's made by Pat Deegan. I don't know if you guys know that name. So do you think I should play it's a 45 seconds. She plays this, she creates this track.
That would be lovely if you could play it.
Okay. So Pat Deegan creates this track to represent what people experience when they are, when in her case, when they meet criteria for schizophrenia. And she's illustrating a whole variety of kinds of voice hearing experiences. So I played this for people. I'll play it now for you.
I came for you. I came for you because you are the one. It's you. You are the one I came for. You are the ones. It's you. It's you. It's you. It's you.
Look at their eyes. Look at them. Their eyes are full of disgust.
You have the way to
You smell. You are disgusting.
It's not super loud. Is it possible that you're not sharing sound?
You are disgusting.
If from the pull down menu at the top of the bar,
Good.
there should be 3 dots, and then make sure you have share sound clicked, and then we can try again.
Okay. So I go to video, I go to audio. What's the click down? Where does it come from? From share?
There should be a bar at the top of your share screen, like a menu bar, and then to the far right portion of that bar, there should be 3 dots. Do you see that?
More.
Yes.
Ah,
And then
excellent.
okay, good. Let's try this again.
Okay.
Stop it now.
Is that better?
Don't touch that. Don't touch it.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Okay. Let me go.
You are the one. I came for you. I came for you because you are the one. It's you. You are the one I came for. You
Stop it.
are the one. It's you. It's you.
Isn't it?
I came for. It's you. It's you.
Look at
and
their
you have
eyes.
the way.
Look at them.
I
Their
came
eyes are
for
full
you.
of disgust.
You have the way.
You smell. You are disgusting.
We know you.
They're looking at you and seeing you, and they see everything you do, and you are disgusting. Yes. Hey, stop it! Stop it now! Don't touch that. Don't touch it.
Okay. All right. So I would play this to people and actually translate it into Fante, which is the local language if people preferred that. And then I would say, is this what the gods sounded like? And so what I saw was kind of a pattern. It's not a, bright line in the sand. There are some people who I thought actually weren't doing much in the way of hearing voices, even though they were a kung fu. And the gods were kind of benign. And when I played this track to them and said, is that what the gods sound like? And they were like, oh my goodness, no. This sounds like a convocation of witches. And there are other people, when they told me their story, they had pretty audible experiences of the gods. They still had audible experiences of demons. They told a pretty convincing story about how they looked quite crazy when they were falling ill. And when I played the track, it was like, oh yeah, that's the way the gods sound. So, but none of these people are ill. They have a job, which is talking to the gods. They have so they've got a profession, and they're not seen as ill by the society. And so I wrote that up there. And I saw a similar kind of pattern when I talked to people who call themselves mediums in the UK, that there are all kinds of different voice hearing experiences. So the mediums, they talk to the dead, and the dead talk to them. And there are all kinds of experiences, but I thought that some people kind of looked like they might have a psychotic process, and other people did not. And the thing that was striking about the mediums in the Kung is that every one of them said, you know, this training really helped. It changed something. So, okay, so this is what I've got just 3 more slides. I want to say that it matters, this material matters to understanding consciousness because it suggests that culture shapes these very fundamental features of the way that people are experiencing their minds. And the broader point is that, how to say this? The voices can be, that's a better way. Voices can be the signals of madness, but I think they're also the signals of a healing, of the human capacity to heal ourselves from within. They are part of the techniques through which we create a kind of inner coach who can interact with us and to change our experience for the better. So let me stop there. Does that make sense? And okay. And we can just talk.
Oh man, that was a very special presentation. Thank you, Tanya.
Oh, you're welcome.
All
Thank
right,
you.
you guys. If we have some hands raised. Now you can raise your hand, which we really like, or you can unmute yourself. But we'll go with the hand raisers first because that's so much more polite, you guys. So first we'll start with Harvey Newman.
Thank you, Dr. Luhrmann, Tanya. I've had many of these experiences. They've all been positive for me, which is fascinating.
So cool. Yeah.
And out of them, I've had songs sung to me. I've had had a riddle that was posed to me on my chosen deathbed, where I had heard womb or tomb over and over again until I figured out what the womb was. And even then, although at that point the womb was a particular location, ultimately I came to the realization because of another voice that came to me in a few months later that said, "I am proud of you, my son." And I realized that it was the universe that was speaking to me, or God, as I describe God as the universe. And it has fashioned for the last 48 years of my life, which is more than half of my life, fashioned a life for me that has been in constant connection with God, although I don't hear God very often. Yeah. But this sense of being supported and safe, and everything is working in my favor, or a learning experience.
That's lovely. That's great.
All right. How about Kira? You have your hand raised.
Yeah, that was so interesting. I have a bunch of questions, but probably not. That was so interesting. Thank you. I guess one is so I have a hard time feeling or experiencing something outside of myself. And I mean, I wonder, okay, so I think I saw many years ago something on 60 Minutes, but nobody else remembers it. So I don't know if I'm imagining it, where they thought that they had found like a gene that makes people more, predisposed to believe. Is there, is there a genetic component? I mean, I have, a long history of abandonment, is that more why that I, out of, nurture, I have a hard time, trusting anything external. And also I Also, okay, one thing is also like the voices that say you're disgusting. I've heard that a lot from people with, from dysfunctional families where they actually were told that they were disgusting. And then also, I guess I want to ask about, the voices shaming about sex in India and the in the United States violent. And it is like, is that connected? Like, is it that violence is more acceptable in the United States than in India, or less, or and is sex more accepted in one country or another? Is it influenced by those things?
Yeah.
I could
Those are
keep.
great
It's so
questions.
interesting. Thank you.
So those are great questions. I'm not the genetics person, but my understanding is that the uh, madness, or I mean, if you're comfortable with diagnostic terms, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, that whole host of stuff. My understanding is that there's no simple genetic explanation. If there's a phenomenon, it's at least polygenetic. It's trauma does seem, but it's clear there's some genetic component for some dimensions of psychiatric distress. Trauma is a risk factor. I mean, trauma is a risk factor for a bunch of stuff that goes wrong for people. It's also, it's a risk factor for cardiovascular illness and, different kinds of autoimmune illness. But there is a strong relationship with people who meet criteria for schizophrenia, for example, and a whole array of different traumatic experiences. The violent sex thing, I do think that you could argue that Americans live in a more violent society. People have made that argument. You can also make the argument that this, intensely individualistic world that we live in, with a sense of like, we have a right to our private space and our own mind, and that our mind is, absolutely really important. Like, Americans give a lot of importance to choosing. I choose what to wear. I choose what to eat. That's who I am. That's, India is a place where what other people want and what your seniors want for you is really important. And so that's probably another piece of this dimension, that the kind of what my friend Hazel Marcus calls interdependency, that's more important in India. And I think those shape the way that people listen to their experience and respond to their experience.
All right. Jen Padron.
Hi, Jen.
Hey, hi. My name is Jen Padron. I'm a big fan of your work, Dr. Luhrmann. I'm so
Thank you.
happy that we were able to get you for this particular spiritual
Thank you.
program every Saturday. It's a terrific thing.
Great, thank you.
And I just wanted to ask you about how, as a clinician here in the US, how I can, as a clinician, and working with earlier for psychosis, for example, during crisis, dissuade the primary provider or the MD or the NP at the crisis stabilization unit because of psychoses. How can I dissuade them from doing all their clinical psychiatric stuff when in fact the individual perhaps just needs a moment and a moment to breathe, to be alone, with everything that they're experiencing.
Great, yeah.
And inevitably they are there in the crisis stabilization involuntarily, of course, because of for a lot of different reasons. And so I guess I'm just curious about how we can integrate your work into a more clinical model that would work for
Yeah.
stabilizing psychoses, for early first psychoses, for basic people who are 16, 30, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really deep question, and obviously I'm not the only person kind of concerned about this domain. It does seem to be possible, or it's might well be the case, that the way somebody is told about their experiences when they are going in this early stage might affect how scary their experiences are. And so one of, so if those of you who are interested in this, Eleanor Longden has an amazing TED Talk that's really very moving. And what she says is in this TED Talk is that, she was under a lot of stress. She started hearing a lot of voices. The voices were sort of neutral and commenting on her. And when she talked to people about this, people were totally freaked out. And then she got scared of the voices. There's probably two dimensions to that story. It is probably true that people end up in the ER because their voices get more mean and scary. But it's probably true that there's also a social response to those voices, which helps to make them more mean and scary. So, one, there are different kinds of interventions, like open dialogue is the name for one medically approved set of practices where, the bottom line is you treat the person as if they are an authority on their own experience, allow them into the conversation. That's one thing. The other thing, and this is Rick Saville West, I think, and Jules Evans, who talk about spiritual emergencies. If you can under if you can hold a person in a space of spiritual emergency and think about the variety of interventions that might be helpful to them, that can be helpful. I mean, it's complicated because though these first episodes can be pretty scary for everybody. But that's a language that some people are recommending.
Yeah, I think there's I think a lot of us here on this particular get together every Saturday are largely peer based, peer centric, certified peer specialists in the US, right? And so what seems to be working with that is a guy called Dr. Dan Fisher. Do you know Dan Fisher?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dan, he does a lot of emotional CPR. We've talked about, his about how ECPR is great for connection and how that helps in crisis with peers doing a one-to-one, face-to-face
Yeah.
connecting with whoever they're talking to, or whoever they're interacting with. And that seems to work. What I want to see is open dialogue get brought down to everybody else because it's such an expensive training. I
Yes.
can't afford open dialogue in New York 1 week. I can't do it, but it needs to be brought down to everybody. Can
I
you
mean,
do that?
oh, I don't know about that, but I do think that your intervention, which is having people who've had similar experiences immediately willing to talk to the person who's having these experiences for the first time, could be pretty helpful. I think, the Hearing Voices movement, I think offers something that's pretty helpful for people, or at least for some people. And the Hearing Voices movement sort of does what the Kung Fu does. And when it's, or at least, like the Ron Coleman Hearing Voices. Ron Coleman is one of the key guys. And when Hearing Voices is sort of this grassroots movement, so there are a lot of versions of Hearing Voices. But the way that one of the key guys, Ron Coleman, talks about it is Hearing Voices. It's a practice where you meet together in a group and you treat the voice as if it's a person, as if it's got its own information. It's useful. You teach people to interact with it. And I think that all of that's probably true. But the other thing that Hearing Voices groups do is just to introduce the person to the fact that other people have these experiences. And that is, I think it's sometimes so scary for people when they have these experiences and they kind of, the experiences have this, and they're very compelling. But there can be very scary if the person comes to realize that other people think that they are profoundly weird. And so talking about the experience with other people, I think, is probably a pretty good first step.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask
Evelyn.
one more question, Dan. Just a
Oh,
second.
I'm sorry, Jen. We have
That's
very
all
little
right.
time left. We
Okay,
can't do
I
it.
want to
Can't do it.
know.
No,
Oh,
Jen,
okay.
the answer is
I'll
no.
put it
I'm
in the chat
sorry.
board.
Put
I'll
it
put
in
it
the
in the
chat.
chat board.
Good
I will
idea.
do that.
All
Thank
right.
you, Dr. Luhrmann.
And you can always go to Tanya's website and contact Tanya that way. Okay, Evelyn, go ahead.
I had when I was first diagnosed, I heard voices. They were very mean, like you said, very violent. And so I checked myself into the hospital. Fast forward to a couple of years, I told my psychiatrist that I was hearing my neighbor or something like that. And he told me, he said, "Oh, take this pill, we'll have you on it for 2 weeks." And then I told him, that I didn't need it. Well, what ended up happening is that I almost died because, it wasn't supposed to be in my system. And I agree with you when you say that, some doctors, they want to do that psychiatric stuff. And that was a really bad experience for me.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I mean, the medication can be pretty helpful for many people, but I'm not a doctor. I do have the sense that um, it can take, even if medication is going to be helpful for somebody, it can take some time to find the right medication, and it can be pretty scary because it's, the medication is it's medication. It affects your body, and it can be terrifying when it doesn't work.
I told him I didn't need any medication because I knew what was going on.
Okay.
All right. I just got back from the little boy's room, and I'm sorry I missed that. But if we should move on, then how about Gabe? Gabe, go ahead.
Hi. So one of the things that being a native indigenous person here in the Americas, we get diagnosed with psychosis and schizophrenia all the time. And I honestly believe it is a misdiagnosis, a misunderstanding of our culture in regards to spiritual awakening, in our culture, because we always talk to our ancestors. We're always connecting with nature. We're always connecting with the universe. We've been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years in holistical practices. With that being said, if the practices are not done properly, it can turn into, bad evil voices and turn into, situations where it becomes violent um, or if we're on substances, and then or if it's due to like a trauma, like generational trauma, it can turn us into, listening to those voices, like someone I mentioned in the chat about the veil. We have to be very careful as Native Indigenous people to make sure that we're interacting and differentiating good from bad voices in our head. So I definitely wanted to make sure I mentioned that. Also, the concept of shaman is a Western terminology for us, for our medicine people and spiritual leaders. But there's definitely a cultural piece of it when it comes to different countries and different ethnicities and diversities that needs to be, accounted for, as well as historical traumas and generational traumas, as well as in the families, whether there's, sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, um, alcohol, mental health disorders, all of that stuff. So, and I have all of that as an individual, so it's definitely something that's incorporated in how we are impacted on hearing these voices, but also on a positive note, I'm also a Christ follower on top of that. So the concept of being a Christ follower and Native Indigenous person will actually enhance my spiritual awakening in a positive way. So it actually helps me be able to be more open-minded about not only my own family and history and culture, but also other religions, other spiritualities, other cultures, other diverse people, and mental health and substance use and all of that. So
That's great. Thank you for.
Yeah, don't I know you?
Sorry. Thank you for sharing. That's great.
yes.
Hey, how you
Oh, wait,
doing?
hold on. What's going on here? We gotta mute somebody.
Um,
All right. All right. Now let's hear from some folks who we don't usually see at the group, who have come today to say hello. Mika, are you there? Mika? All right, if you're having some audio problems, we'll keep going, moving on. Stacy Honey, hello, Stacy.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hi, do you have any thoughts and feelings on today's presentation?
Um, well, yes, sometimes I do hear the voices as well, but it's not as much chaos going on like in the video that we heard in the beginning.
Yeah.
But I also think that is a spiritual thing with me as well. It's not something that needs to be medicated because I've tried medication before and it didn't do anything. So I feel like at the end of the day, I guess I'm supposed to hear the voices, and they're not like negative things. It's just at first it's like overwhelming, but I'm
Mhm.
learning to accept it and see it as a blessing.
That's great.
Thanks.
All right, how about Elena, who's on the iPhone? Elena, are you there? Did Elena just disappear?
Elena's here, but she's muted.
Oh, let's encourage them to unmute. Elena, can you say hi to us?
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes.
In regard to voices in my head, I haven't experienced much. I'm fairly new to spirituality, like I've been practicing the last 2 years, and I find myself sometime in my meditation seeking answer, asking for answers. And I remember one time I was in a deep heart opening meditation where I needed to shed some light in regards to some life choices that I'm about to take that will impact other people. It will impact my children. And I remember, I remember being so in pain for the pain that I will cause in their heart. And there was like this download that I got. It wasn't a voice that I hear in my ears, and it said something around. Love will heal the pain caused from love. And I couldn't understand the concept. I couldn't understand what was told to me. I tried to write it down, and I couldn't even use the words that were used. And I know that it doesn't come from my mind because I am not able to understand the concept, but it was loud and clear. Like it almost interrupt me. It's like, oh no, I'm like out there saying the reason, like feeling more than saying the reason, and it's like all of a sudden, the love, something around the pain from love will be healed with more love. I think it's this. And in another case, I'm here like I'm trying to understand which path to take, and I seek an answer, and it's like, what should I do about it? It's like, is this the correct path? And I don't know if that was like simply my mind, but I got something like, why would you be losing so much time into researching this for your own growth if it wasn't for taking it out in the world? And it was like ironic, like almost making fun of me, like duh. And these are the simple experience that I had. But in regards to having clear voices, clear messages, I am not at that point. They were pretty positive, I would say.
I mean, I think one of the questions that people ask in the, in the scientific scholarly community is, what defines a voice? And so many people will argue that we use this word voice and that it sounds like to many people that means that this experience is a clear auditory chunk of words. And it's pretty clear that when you talk to people that there's a broader array of experiences, that people often feel a sense of presence, they often have visual or other sensory dimensions, that there aren't always words, that it doesn't necessarily, so your experience of a download, and I mean, that word is used by many people to describe experiences that feel like they have force, but they aren't necessarily words. Sometimes I've heard people say, well, it makes me feel like a writer because I know there's a message, but when I experience the message, I have to put words to it in order to understand what the message is. And so, and I think we're, the psychiatric community, the kind of community of scholars around these questions, around the domain of spiritual experience, we're still learning about the richness and the variety of these experiences. And so the word voice may be, I mean, I think in general, the word voice should be thought of as a bigger category than it often is. But I think there are many experiences beyond voices that are even broader. And I think we're sort of at an early stage of understanding what those phenomena are. The other side of this, the other pathway I haven't spoken about is sleep. I mean, sleep is another, what do I mean by pathway? Mechanism, sort of some kind of organic or neural structure. Sleep is a domain through which people have vivid experiences that don't feel like them, and they can be quite powerful. And then it's up to the individual to try to make the judgment of how to understand the meaning of these experiences.
Yeah, surely. And they are like, can be confusing at times, but I think eventually answer will come as, they get experienced. But yeah, they are surely not conventional, Sandy. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
All right. Ananda, we haven't heard from you. How are you, Ananda? Ananda Kapoor? I'll ask you to unmute. All right, let's give it 4, 3, 2. All right, we're moving right along. Let's see who else we have here. Tiffany, you're usually quite inquisitive. Let's ask you to unmute. Okay.
I don't really have anything today. I'm listening. It's an interesting topic to think of how people hear voices and how we could maybe learn something from how Ghana is working with people rather than immediately putting it into this clinical sphere, like giving it another place to giving this phenomenon another place to exist, and maybe that's something that has to happen at the family level. Maybe it's not something that'll be a systematic change, but maybe it'll change inside of families first. So maybe that's the only place that it really can change right now. I don't know. So yeah, thank you for showing up today, Dr. Luhrmann.
Thank you for having me. It would be nice if in our country and culture, there were sort of a softer embrace of these experiences. I think it would help people feel less afraid, less alone, and it might help to kind of, I think it would be helpful for people who have these experiences and find them unnerving.
Charles, you were patiently silent. Do you have something?
Well, when I was in college, I was unhappy with the way my life was going. So I saw this eccentric psychologist who said, there's no such thing as mental illness, there's no such thing as therapy. And he would say, I'm only responsible for myself. Well, a couple of years later, I started having experiences, and he said, I should go to the hospital. So I did, and the psychiatrist there tried to force his views on me when I said there was no such thing as mental illness. He said, there is such a thing, I've seen it, which made me not trust him. He said if I didn't keep seeing him, he'd put me in the hospital. Anyway, 6.5 years later, I finally got on a medication that worked. And in 1996, I got on an even better medication. And so now I have no symptoms of the schizophrenia. What was I going to say? I did become spiritual during that time. After when I was in my recovery, I was reading Fritz Perls' book, Gestalt Therapy, verbatim, and he said that the body is very complicated. And I thought, well, how do the nerves know not to bump into the blood vessels and the bones and how, when the body's being formed? So I had this sort of argument by design, and I explored different spiritual paths. And then I found the Vedanta Society where I currently go. I've also read your books. I'm really impressed by them. And my spiritual advisor or guru now says I should imagine myself in the room with Sri Ramakrishna when we're studying with him. But I have a really hard time with that. To me, it's just an intellectual thing. And I have a hard time making a real personal connection. And by the way, before I was on medication, I never really heard voices. I used to see things rather than hear things. But I now facilitate a hearing voices group, and it includes visions and other sensations and beliefs, not just voices.
Good for you. That's interesting, and I'm struck. The more I talk to people, the more respect I have for the diversity of the what people experience mentally in their minds, for want of a better term. And I think there is an enormous variation. It's good to know that you're facilitating a hearing voices group.
Among other groups.
Good for you.
I'm a certified peer recovery specialist.
Very cool.
Well, Charles, we hope to see you at more of these groups, okay?
Well, actually, I'm usually in my guided meditation at my spiritual center during this time, but I took off from that to hear Tanya today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, next time you're at the meditation, just keep your spirit with us, okay? All right. Martha, I'm sorry to call you out, Martha, but I know you've got a lot going on in that intelligent mind of yours.
Thank you. I really appreciated you giving us insight into the cultural aspect of hearing voices rather than taking, I don't know, an anti-psychiatry stance. I'm somebody with a diagnosis of bipolar 1, and I've heard and seen things. And I've been in the mental health system for 30 years. And the biggest issue that I've had with my own peers is people hating psychiatrists as somehow a means to feel positive about their experiences. The things that I've seen and heard, some of them have been banal. They've been like girlfriends complaining in the other room of their exes. Some of them have been comforting. Somebody appeared to me and told me that I had the option of being hospitalized, and I made the process easier, but that person wasn't really there. Some of them have been full of insight. I was at a job where there was a lot of bullying, and so I saw 3 teenage girls bullying one another, and that was my moment of insight. but I would be dead without psychiatric medication. I mean, two things can be true at once. So I really, really kind of appreciate you, and I don't mean this bad, sort of staying in your lane, because I found the talk insightful for that reason. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I also think it can be underappreciated how helpful these experiences can be for people who clearly meet a diagnosis. So, I mean, there's sometimes a temptation to say, well, if somebody meets criteria for a diagnosis, all their experiences are symptoms and they're wrong and they're false. And it's only if there's another, they don't mean a diagnosis that you should take the experiences seriously. And that is not what I have heard from people. I mean, so first of all, one can make, it depends on your faith commitments, whether you will treat somebody as veridically experiencing a God. But you are also saying that sometimes these experiences can give insight and hope and useful instruction for people. And that is also what I have seen. It's that the voices can be helpful. That's super important.
Chaplain James, are you with us, or are you still on that phone call? I'll ask you to. Oh, hi, Chaplain James. What's on your mind?
Yes. Her name is she's the doctor.
Can you repeat that?
Is she a doctor?
Dr. Tanya Luhrmann, yes.
All right. Hello, doctor. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you, Chaplain?
I want you to know that at the beginning of this, you had me going, what? It was very confusing. But when you
I'm
got
sorry
to
about
the
that.
part, don't be sorry. When you got to the part about doing the test, I like that, and I would like to do that test with you. Also, I firmly agree. Yes, people in India would be different from the way of thinking, what they're thinking, and how they think from us here in America. Yes, your thinking would be aligned with the culture, the way you brought up, and how you'll do it. Yeah, so I understood your conclusions and I agree with them totally. And I want to take that test.
Okay.
I put my information in the chat, so do by all means do contact me.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Great talk. Great talk.
Thank you.
Tanya, has there been any research about immigrants from Ghana and India and other parts of the world who have come to the United States and experienced psychosis?
I've thought of doing that project and I haven't yet, but I would like to do it.
All right. Bonnie Shell, you've been quiet. Well, let's hear from you.
One, I learned, I think in my 30s, never to tell a psychiatrist who had the power to change my medication that I heard anything or saw anything. And when I was younger, they would go on and on about, was the voice inside your head or outside your head? This is important to you. As I've gotten older, and I'm 80 now, I think that I receive messages in a different way. Sometimes I might dream and see an obituary of somebody who's a good friend and alive, and it has a date. And I don't pay that much attention to the date, but it puts me on alert to contact them. Or I wake up with somebody's name. that I haven't thought of, and there's no reason to think of them. And I don't know if that's, I mean, I'm not, if you're brought up with God as the still small voice, which is better than the Old Testament wrath, I think you'll continue to interpret things in that framework. Even so, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's kind of striking in the religious context that God has been understood as kinder over the years.
Yes.
I mean, it's quite striking as you go from, like, you know, the era in which Jesus was born until now. It's clearly Christians imagine God as increasingly kinder. And you probably could make that claim about the Hebrew God and the Jewish experience of God as well.
Yes.
That's interesting.
But I mean, the thing now that's so influential, the apostolic prophetic something or other. I mean, all the kindness is gone. It's just prophets and condemnation and burning one group, and you
That's
can
a
hang
really,
on to that part. It's dividing the bad from the good and the elect from the unelect, and it's the way our country looks at everything in extremes.
that's actually a very interesting comment. Just heard a guy called Matthew Taylor talk about this new phase in the in evangelical interpretation that is very dichotomous and distinguishes between, you know, the elect and the demonic. And I think that that may be a broader current in our country than I had initially imagined.
Now, since this presentation was had its complexities, there will be a video that I will circulate to everyone where you can review. You could pause on the text, read the text to yourself, listen to the narration, and really, like, I'm planning on doing this myself, replaying the video and watching it closely, and learning. And now let's see, Redmi 10A, are you with us, Redmi? I'll ask you to unmute. Redmi 10A, please say something. All right. Oh, there you are.
It's John. It's John.
Oh, hi, John. John from Nigeria?
Yes, I'm here. It's John.
John,
Yes, John from Nigeria. Yeah.
did you find it interesting, this talk of the experience of Ghanaian people and so forth?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It's very interesting.
What are your thoughts on everything?
I believe that every one of us hear voices. I believe every human hear voices. And those voices varies. I also hear voices. People tell me that I do hear voices. But the fact is that where is that voice coming from is actually what matters. Is it coming from a good spirit or a bad spirit? Because sometimes we may find it difficult to understand when we make wrong decisions in terms of the spirit we are listening to. And our life sometimes can be shaped by the spirits we listen to too. That's what I just try to get from there. Everyone hears voices. It may not be loud, but you are hearing voices because most of your actions are as a result of the voices you are hearing. Whether you are listening to them determines how you go with it, or whether you're not listening to them. That's why sometimes you ask yourself, I was made to do this, but why I didn't take this action? Why? Because something have actually spoken to you, taking this decision, but you decided not to take it. That's my point.
I certainly think that all humans have many internal commands, and that they often don't feel entirely like they come from them.
Yep.
So I'm sympathetic to that description.
Sila, is your audio working, Sila?
Yes, it is.
Oh, I had no idea. Okay, what's on your mind, Sila?
Oh yeah. John just said something that I thought about earlier during the conversation, and according to the course I took in metaphysics, is whereas everybody hear voices, and it depends on how you react to them. And before there was telephone, there was tell a neighbor. You can hear a neighbor all across somewhere else, and it comes into your energy field. You hear it somehow or another. It attached to you, and it depends on if you're going to act on it or not. Because you have to remember there's always you to make your own decisions. Influences, voices influence. And then it depends for me to whether I'm going to take that action or not. So yeah, people hear voices. I don't think it's some people are just out of control with it. It can be a mental illness or become a mental illness. And that's where balance comes in for you to control yourself. And and it depends, there's many factors, your personality, they call it. And all of this, emotional stability and all of that stuff comes into play. And this is what they call you developing your lower or your higher self. So either, you're going to be out there wilding out, with all this instability, and then on top of that, it can become a problem. Yeah, mental health situation. Yeah, it can, but it depends on the choices we make in our lives. Either we're going to dig deeper into it like Tanya, that is, and like she did. We dig deeper into it, or we're going to just run crazy with it and allow it to control us. Because we also have to know that this is not only a physical world we live in, but it's also a spiritual world. And the spiritual world is overwhelmingly debunked. That's just, my saying, my experience. Because yeah, I go through what they call psychosis. And I had to tell myself, no, I'm not crazy, and I know I'm not. So I started to listen. I started to listen. And then, this has been going on with me ever since I was a child. So if God is good, then I'll follow God. Because I did, I was like, no, that's not me. My personality is not to hurt people, not to harm people, not even myself. And then they got all this stuff in the physical, alcohol, drugs, and the pharmaceuticals that are opposed to what is natural that people are overwhelmingly talking about today that can really help people without these side effects, which can be dangerous, to develop another problem on top of the one that you have. It's a whole lot of stuff. So, we have to make the best choices for ourselves and delve into the physicalities and the spiritualities in the world and the universe of which we live, our beingness. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, that sounds deep.
Well, oh yes, Tanya, you had your mouth in mid-sentence.
No, I was just going to say it's deep. I'm actually going to need to disappear.
That's all right. We're ending right now, Tanya.
No,
Thank you very much, Tanya Luhrmann, for an incredibly thought-provoking presentation. Thank you, everyone, for coming. If you hadn't spoken, I'm sorry we missed you, but you'll have another chance next week, and everyone will get the video. Please review it. Please learn. And if you have any further questions for Tanya, she has a website, and I will put the website. Can you put the website in the chat? I don't know. Someone you put the website. I'll put the website in the email I send to everyone. How about that?
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
I love you all.
A really great set of conversation.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.